The opinions expressed on the radio program by the hosts, co-hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions and responsibility of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Genesis Radio, www.genesisradio.com, Genesis Radio's owners, management, or affiliates.
Good evening, and welcome to another edition of My Brother's Keeper. So tonight, now that the election has been, at least for the most part, decided, I think it's important that we talk about our outgoing president, or possibly outgoing president. You know, the votes have been tallied, and it appears that there is no debate that Joe Biden won the election. But when Donald Trump was elected, people thought that he was, well, in a sense, they're right. He was anti-establishment. He was not an established politician. He was not a Washington insider. He did not know his way around the Beltway. So people thought that he was not part of what's called the deep state. Let's talk a little bit about the deep state. For the most part, this is something that has recently been part of the national debate. We didn't talk about the deep state. For the most part, because they stayed so deep, we didn't know who they were, how they operated, and their inner workings. Now, in recent history, we've begun to explore more about the deep state and how they operate and how they control the global economy and also U.S. politics. So people thought that because Donald Trump had not been in and out of Washington, that he was not part of that and that he was not under their control. You know, there was been some information floating around the internet that a number of indictments had been unsealed and were going to be handed up against a number of key Washington insiders, entertainers, you know, from various art forms. Yet, no one has been indicted. Formally, as yet, no one certainly has been arrested. So, a question that I had was, how do you indict the deep state? You know, it's easy to say we're going to charge some people, and there were a number. These indictments allege things like kidnapping children, the murder of children, sacrifice, and things of that nature. And Trump was supposed to be trying to stop this activity. But again, how do you indict the deep state? And it's important to understand exactly who it is that comprises the deep state and how they operate. Now, first of all, the deep state is a term that we use, but they're actually known by a number of different names. Some call them Illuminati. Some refer to them as the Knights of the Round Table, or there was a group founded by Cecil Rhodes called the Round Table. There's the Council of 300. There are a number of groups that make up, I guess, what you call the outer ring of the deep state or the Illuminati. Inside the center of Illuminati are a group of very wealthy, powerful families that control the global economy. Now, how do they do that, particularly here in this country? Well, if you take out any bill, $10 bill, $1 bill, whatever you want to take out, and you look at it, what you will not find on that bill is the word money, because it's not. What you will find is the term U.S. currency. Is there a difference between currency and money? Absolutely. But anyway, these bills you look at, these notes, these Federal Reserve notes, they are printed by the Federal Reserve. So if you think about it, you have to ask yourself a question. If the Federal Reserve is federal and it is controlled by the U.S. government, how is the government in debt to itself? Now, currently, I think we're $21 or $22 trillion in debt. How can we be in debt to ourselves if we're printing the money? The answer is that the deep state, sometimes called the Illuminati and other names, actually owns and operates the Federal Reserve banks. Not just in this country, but many countries around the world have a Federal Reserve banking system that is controlled by the inner core of the Illuminati. Now, how does that relate to Donald Trump? In one of the last debates that Donald Trump, matter of fact, it was brought up in a debate, and also he did a town hall meeting, and he was asked about his debt. So he admitted to being, I think it was $421 million in debt. Now they're saying that the debt could be as high as $1 billion. So here's where it gets interesting. Donald Trump primarily borrowed that money from Deutsche Bank. But who controls Deutsche Bank? If Deutsche Bank is one of the banks that is a front for the deep state, then how could Donald Trump be operating independently of the deep state? And throughout the history of this country, it has been very difficult for legislators in this country to operate outside of the deep state. Probably the last time we had a U.S. president that really wanted to expose the inner workings of this group, that would have been John F. Kennedy. And he talked about, in some of his speeches, he talked about secrecy and how repugnant it is in a democracy. And he and his brother, Robert Kennedy, were talking about doing things like going away from the Federal Reserve System and also ending the CIA, which is something that Trump has talked about kind of peripherally, but never any real attempt to end the power of the CIA, which is a very, very powerful organization. It's not supposed to operate in the United States. It's supposed to be operating overseas, gathering intelligence on other foreign governments. But who does the CIA actually work for? That's another question that we need to explore. But we all know what happened with Kennedy. Kennedy, about a week or so before he was assassinated, he released a signing statement. I think it's 11112, if I'm not mistaken. And in that signing statement, he talked about ending the Federal Reserve System. Well, when he got to Dallas, Texas, there was basically a number of assassins waiting for him. You know, we are told that he was shot from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository. But if you look at how he reacted to being shot, the first shot, if you look at, and it's called a Zapruder film, if you look at the Zapruder film and you break it down into segments, the first thing you'll see is Kennedy grasping his throat. The first shot actually struck him in his throat. Then there's another shot that, and you see his head, it goes back violently. The impact of the bullet, it blew his head back, blew his brains out. And there's no way that a shot from above and behind him could have caused that sort of impact. So this was something that was planned, and this just shows you the power of this particular group. The fact that Trump was able to exist 4 years in office and there not be any sort of attempt on his life is questionable if you are attempting to break the power of this group that we refer to as the deep state. And again, my question is, how do you indict the deep state? How do you indict this group? Well, how they operate in this country, aside from controlling the economic system through the Federal Reserve, they control finance. They also control things like the criminal justice system. They controlled the educational system, and they also control the media. So if they're in control of the criminal justice system, what will you do with these indictments? Who is actually going to sentence members of the deep state to prison? Keep in mind that in this country, a number of our prisons are privately owned. Who actually owns these prisons? Who are the people behind these prisons that put up the money and that are now actually incentivizing people to bring in a fresh supply of bodies? And we don't think about it in terms of the amount of money that's generated by prisoners. We know that when a prison comes to an area, it creates jobs, it creates opportunities. So people become correction officers, they can become counselors, nurses, doctors. It's a whole industry that's created in that community. But inside the prison, the prisoners work for Fortune 500 companies. These are the people that invest in what's called the CCA, or Corrections Corporation of America. So they invest in these prisons, and they take these prisoners, and they have them doing things like telemarketing. Just imagine if you could take someone and pay them 11 cents an hour to do jobs that on the outside of the prison walls, you'd have to pay people $10, $15 an hour or more. And you don't have to provide any health benefits whatsoever. They have very little in the way of rights. No unions, nothing like that. So when you think of it in those terms, you see how much money can be generated for these organizations, or for this organization that we'll call the deep state. So, I was talking to my son, actually, who is somewhat conspiratorial. And, he was pointing out that Trump, his administration had talked about and even supposedly launched these indictments against these people. Yet, 4 years have passed and not a single person has been put on trial. Was there a real effort aimed at breaking this cycle? And when I talk about this cycle, what I'm referring to is we have a major problem in this country with trafficking, human trafficking. Mm-hmm. So where are all these children, these women, where are they going? Who is looking for them? After a while, you become a cold case, and nobody's really looking for you anymore. And if you think about it, back in the 80s, we had the Atlanta child murders. I can't even tell you how many children were killed off the top of my head or that disappeared. After a while, they arrested one man, Wayne Williams, who was accused of killing one child, and it is very doubtful he ever killed any children at all. After he was arrested, he was tried and convicted. The case went silent. Now, 35 years or so later, there has been a documentary talking about what happened down in Atlanta. And they wanted to identify some suspects. Well, now, here we are, we're having the same sort of activity now. People are disappearing from all around the world. Where are they going? In some countries, prostitution is legal. Even in this country and outside of the city of Las Vegas, prostitution is legal. So all of these women are not being brought into prostitution. There's something people believe much more sinister going on. And they talk about places like the Bohemian Grove in California. Now out there you have an annual gathering of very wealthy and powerful men. Only men are invited. And there was a guy by the name of Alex Jones. And some of you may know Alex Jones. He has InfoWars. Well, he snuck into the Bohemian Grove and he actually captured a lot of not the actual ceremony, but he captured what's inside the Bohemian Grove and he put it on film. and there is a statue, a huge statue of the god Molech. And at the, I guess, in front of Molech is a place where you would have sacrifices, or sacrifices would be made to the god Molech. So, throughout history, and if you, the Bible's loaded with instances of blood sacrifices, and that has been part of some religious practices. Well, could that be what's going on today? Are people being sacrificed? There's been a number of questions that have been raised about some disappearances and people who suddenly found themselves in positions of power and authority who may not have gotten there unless there was a sacrifice made. Now, I don't want to get too deep into that, but I just wanted to focus on Trump and his relationship. Because we have to keep in mind that prior to Trump becoming the president of the United States, his last job was The Apprentice, or the star of The Apprentice. On that show, his persona, what he said, how he reacted, all of this was scripted. This was not a show that showed the actual inner workings of his company. We now know from Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, that the Trump companies consist of just a handful of people. It's not some huge organization. And we also know that Trump is nowhere near as wealthy as he himself has reported. So a lot of his persona now as president is crafted. And a lot of what he says, well, it's just what he's saying. Again, there's people on social media that have shown actual documentation, copies of these alleged indictments. Yet, what has happened? Who has been arrested? And now, after the election, Trump has yet to concede. And there may be a number of reasons why. But, what's troubling is that there are still people, and there was just a Million MAGA march on D.C. last Saturday, where there was a caravan that came up from different parts of the country to protest the results of this election. Now, this is what's interesting about that. About 4 years ago, Donald Trump was elected. Upon his election, there were a number of Democratic senators who wanted to find some reason, some legal reason to impeach the president. Well, when this situation happened with the Ukrainian president, where Trump allegedly asked for a favor, they thought that was the smoking gun. That way they could finally get him out of office. Well, if you recall, the Republican establishment said, wait a minute, the Democrats are trying to undo the 2016 election, that they are trying to subvert the will of the American people. They said that Donald Trump won the election fair and square, and that the Democrats could not accept that. Okay. The impeachment process ended in 2019. And of course, while he was impeached, he was not convicted by the Senate. Well, after the election, you have the Republican administration saying that Donald Trump won the election, when in fact it is clear, the ballots have been tallied, he did not win. So now you have the same party that said it was unfair the way the president was being treated by the Democrats are now trying to subvert the will of the American people and are trying to undo the result of the 2020 election. But why would they do that? People are saying that Donald Trump is now the leader of the Republican Party. But what is he leading them to? Look at the electoral map. A Democrat has not won the state of Georgia since 1992. Trump lost that. Arizona was a ruby red state. Trump lost that too. Nevada had a tendency to swing either way, but now Nevada's lost. The upper Midwest is lost to the Democratic Party. So this was not the landslide that the media had been predicting, but it's sort of the building blocks that the Democrats are trying to reestablish the blue wall. And right now down in Georgia, there are 2 senatorial seats that are headed for a runoff. If those 2 candidates in Georgia win, they will flip the Senate and they'll have control of both houses of Congress. So with Trump as the head of the Republican Party, look at the results. Look at the electoral map. And let's look at elections that are coming. 2 years from now, we're going to have the midterms. How will the Republicans fare if they keep Donald Trump as the head of their party? Things are not looking good for the Republicans. And if you looked at the caravan that came up, that was in Washington, what you saw was probably 95% of people, and maybe as high as 98% of people, were white people. After Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were elected, around the country, celebrations broke out in some of the largest cities, New York, Philly, Los Angeles, and you saw people, a diverse crowd, black, brown, white, Hispanic, Asian, everybody was united. Everybody was celebrating the win of Biden and Harris. So what we're having is major divisions in this country. But who benefits from that? You know, again, when we talk about indicting the deep state, it's almost impossible. You know, and if a foreign power wanted to overthrow the government, now would be an opportune time. We have a government that's in a state of disarray. We have a country that's divided. Half of the country, 72 million people, voted for Donald Trump. Half of the country wants to keep Donald Trump in office, despite the fact that he's lost the election, despite hand counts, despite recounts. It is clear now that he has lost, but people are not willing to accept the outcome because there is a contingent of followers that believe that Donald Trump is still the man to lead this country and that he is the one who will stand up to the deep state. But again, how do you indict something that's basically invisible? It's basically an invisible system. It's a power that you know is there, but you don't see it. And if they are in control of the criminal justice system, who's going to jail? So I think we need to re-look or re-examine what we think about the possibly outgoing president. I mean, he's going to leave at some point, but he will not leave quietly. But we need to re-examine that because throughout Trump's history, and if you look at his history, and not the history that's been crafted for him, but his real history, Donald Trump has never been anti-deep state. He's never challenged him on anything. And again, he borrowed huge sums of money. Now, how do you borrow money from banks that are possibly controlled by the deep state if you are not part of the deep state? Or if you pose a threat to the deep state, why would they give you money? So it does not really make much sense if you look at it critically, you know, again, for presidents who did not or stepped outside of the demands of the deep state, there's always a punishment. And if you think about it, somewhere around, I guess, I don't know, maybe 85 or 86, somebody walked up to Ronald Reagan and shot him in the chest. Now think about it. The President of the United States is ringed by Secret Service agents, well-trained Secret Service agents that keep people at a safe distance away from the President. And not only is he ringed by Secret Service agents, whenever the president moves from one location to another, there's an advance team that is in the crowd dressed as, average, onlookers. You don't know who they are. But somehow, this guy that's supposed to be a lunatic works his way through the crowd, works his way through a contingent of well-trained Secret Service agents, walks up to the president, and gets within, 10 feet or so, pulls out a gun. Now think about it. Reaches in and pulls out a gun, and nobody reacts in time to stop him, and he gets a shot off and hits the president. Was someone sending him a message? Was a message sent from the deep state? Was there something that Reagan had done that angered members of the deep state? And this was his punishment? Going back to JFK, after he was killed, well, actually he was shot, he was taken to Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Well, he was declared dead. And normally, an autopsy is performed, right, to determine cause of death, which in this case, it was pretty obvious. But what happened was his brain was removed. Why would they do that? Well, the answer is simple. The trajectory of the bullets that were fired from behind him would not match the wounds on him, on his body. So they took out his brain, and of course that disappeared, along with other evidence. Now, years later, we know that the actor from Cheers, Woody, I can't remember his real name, but his father was one of the people that was involved in the assassination of JFK. And he's talked about that. I think his name is Woody Harrelson.
Yep, that's his name.
Yeah, he talked about that his father, there were a number of, they were called that time hobos, who supposedly got off a train in Dallas and who were in the crowd and who fired shots at the president. So, Woody Harrelson talks about that. So, this was a setup, and it was government sponsored, but who was behind the actual planning? Why did they want this this young, charismatic president dead? Who wanted it and why? So, we say that he is anti-deep state, but what he's doing doesn't suggest that. It suggests that Trump is just, another politician, and apparently not a very good one. Because typically a sitting president, very few have not been reelected. Most serve 2 terms. And as a sitting president, and let me just add to that, as a popular sitting president, what you do is you strengthen the position of your party. Now, going back to this election, there were 2 key Senate races. One was in Kentucky, Mitch McConnell, and the other was in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham was in trouble in South Carolina. Now, if you have a popular president in office, any senator wants that president sitting next to them on a podium or standing next to them supporting them. Lindsey Graham didn't ask Trump to come to South Carolina. Why would that be if Trump is a popular president? Mitch McConnell, who is the current Senate Majority Leader, didn't ask him to come to Kentucky either, which is curious. If you really think that the president is headed for re-election and that you think the president is popular around the country, why wouldn't you ask him to come to your state and help you gain re-election? So I think it was known that Trump was in deep trouble. Just as we looked at these pundits or heard these pundits and saw the polls, they saw him as well. And they thought, well, it's not looking good for the president. Some of them began to abandon ship. After the election was called in favor of Joe Biden, some of them are still feeding the president's ego. They don't want to come to grips with the fact that the Trump experiment is over. And they don't want to have to look at the damage, the short-term as well as the long-term damage of 4 years of Trump in office. So, again, 2 years from now, we're going to have the midterm elections. And if Trump is still in a position of power in the Republican Party, provided he is not in prison, and that's another reason why he doesn't want to leave the White House. You know, I know that people are saying that this whole global pandemic was designed to get Trump out of office. Okay, let's say that were the case, but it is a global pandemic. There are other countries, hundreds of countries involved. Their leaders in, some of the places that were hardest hit took decisive action to shut down their economies if necessary, to mandate mask wearing, social distancing, who, used other forms of medications that may not be approved by the FDA in this country. And they managed to manage or mitigate the spread of COVID around in other countries. In this country, it is currently exploding. Here in this part of Pennsylvania, our numbers have been relatively low. Now we're having an explosion even in our little section of the world. Our numbers are going up dramatically. If Trump, from day one, instead of downplaying it and saying that, oh, it's just no worse than a bad case of the flu, if he had told people, look, this is a very deadly virus. This virus can kill. If he put on a mask, if he told the Republican establishment, push mask wearing, push social distancing, make people aware of the dangers of COVID, the outcome of the election may have been different. But instead, he stuck to a plan that was pretty foolish if you think about it. People try to compare COVID-19 to H1N1. H1N1 did not shut down the global economy. H1N1 did not kill 250,000 Americans. There's really no comparison, in terms of the cost in human life, in terms of the economic cost. There's no comparison whatsoever. So, if he had taken decisive action, there's a possibility that he could have won re-election. But because of, I guess he just couldn't get out of his own way in a sense. Every president has advisors, and you have them for a particular reason, because nobody knows everything. So you have your advisors give you good, sound advice. For some reason, Trump got rid of those who did not think his idea of ignoring the pandemic was a good idea. You know, even after he claimed to have been infected by the virus, he still did not push for things like mask wearing, for things like social distancing. While the numbers were beginning to tick up, one of the things he was doing was holding these mass rallies, which we now know are now referred to as super spreader events. If you are the president of the United States and your number one job is protection of the American people, why would you host super spreader events? And yeah, you can say that the deep state engineered this virus. Okay, that's nothing new. This has been done many times. You know, most notably the AIDS virus. Now let's talk a little bit about the comparison between AIDS and the COVID crisis. For those of us old enough to remember, the first reported cases of AIDS, it wasn't even called AIDS. It was called GRIDS. It was called Gay Men Related Infectious Disease Syndrome. And it was only affecting gay men in the Bay Area of California. Well, how did this disease suddenly just pop up out of nowhere? Well, some of the people that worked on doing research on the AIDS virus, some of them are still in Washington. One of them, I think, is a man by the name of Fauci. But anyway, we were told that when the AIDS virus hit, there had been some cross-contamination between something called a green monkey, and that it had jumped into the human population and it started this retrovirus. Now, how did it get to the San Francisco Bay Area? Okay, that was 39 years ago. Fast forward 2019, we were told that this coronavirus was a result of bats. That somehow bats and humans came in contact, and that there was cross-contamination, just as there was with the so-called rhesus or green monkey. They just substituted monkey with a bat. We're told erroneously that people in China were eating bats. Now, I don't know of anybody that munches down on bat burger, but that story sounds curiously like what we were told about the HIV outbreak. So yes, the HIV virus was a retrovirus, sort of like what the coronavirus is. The coronavirus constantly mutates. So when we talk about a vaccine, and there are a number of them that they say are showing promising results, but how do you vaccinate against a virus that mutates? Just as HIV got into every cell, it appears that coronavirus is as well. But now, how does a virus, a simple virus, mutate? Mutation takes hundreds of years. It's not something that happens rapidly. It takes hundreds, sometimes millions of years for an organism to mutate. The coronavirus mutates very rapidly. That goes to tell you this is not something that is simply a normal organism like the flu. This is something that, was made in a lab somewhere, just as the HIV virus was made in a lab and it was released on populations that nobody would really pay attention to. Realistically, now we can go back and we can do the research, and we can find out that gay men were vaccinated with they were giving them the hepatitis B vaccine, and they were using tainted samples that had been injected with the HIV virus. In Africa, they told the people that they were vaccinating them against smallpox. So while there was an outbreak on the west coast of this country, in Africa, the disease was running rampant. So chemical warfare is not new. It was the response to it that was the problem with the President Donald J. Trump. If he has, as I said, taken decisive action, Trump may have easily won re-election. In fact, when this virus first hit, in probably February or March of this year, pretty much that was Trump's opportunity then to talk about the deep state, to tell the American people about the existence of the deep state, something that John F. Kennedy tried to do. If you listen to his speeches about secrecy, he was talking about the inner workings of the deep state. And, again, they're around, but who are they? You have to understand the deep state has infiltrated Congress, both houses. The deep state is in the Supreme Court. It is in all branches of government. It is in all matters of finance. It is part of our criminal justice system, part of our media, because if you think about it, what does our media really report on? So all of these are arms or tentacles of the deep state, and Trump certainly did not break that cycle. I don't know if he ever really intended to, because if he did, there would have been major disruptions in this country. George H.W. Bush, well, it was pretty well known inside Washington that the Bush family was part of the deep state. And George H.W. Bush, made no secret of that. When he gave his inaugural speech in 1988, he said, or he talked about 1,000 points of light. So if you go back and you listen to that speech, you understand he was letting it be known who he represented. And if you go do a little research on the Bush family, you find out they're not from Texas. They are from the East Coast. They're right from New York City. They moved up to Connecticut, but they're from New York. George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, was in the banking industry in New York City. And the Bush family, among some other families in this country, heavily supported Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. But that's another story. But I don't think that Trump was really trying to do away with the control that the deep state has over this country. It is too deeply entrenched. Now, there is a way to break the cycle, but you can't do it in Washington. It begins with the American people being aware first of the existence of the deep state, knowing who they are, how they control, then you can break the cycle. But as American people, what we do is every year we follow the rules. But whose rule? Whose rules? We're paying taxes. Every year we pay a good portion of our income taxes to the government. The government then takes that money and pays back debt. But again, debt to whom? If the Federal Reserve is federal, we cannot be in debt to yourself. It's like, you know, me loaning myself money. Impossible. And it is impossible for us to be in debt to our own country, our own government. So you need to do a little research on the deep state and the Federal Reserve System. And you find that there are a number of Federal Reserve systems all over the world, but they're controlled by one small cabal. And some of these names that for years were whispered, and now we know who they are. We know about the Rothschild family. We know about the Bronfmans. We know about the Lees, and there's about 10 others that control about 96% of the world's wealth. And going back to the currency versus money argument, well, there's really no argument. If you look at any dollar bill from 1 to 100, you will see U.S. currency. What money actually is gold, it's diamond, it's diamonds, it's resources. The paper that we have is worthless. The only value it has is the value they tell us it has. And if you think about it, right now, if you have $100 bill, how long does it last? If you go to the supermarket with $100 bill, how much can you buy? What is your buying power? Take that same $100 bill 30 years ago. You walk into a supermarket, you can feed a family for a week. Today, $100 bill, you can feed a family for maybe 2 days if you're lucky. If you shop at one of the discount supermarkets. But the American buying power is diminishing yearly. We're working harder, but getting less. Who's behind that? Who's behind American business companies, Fortune 500 companies, shipping the jobs overseas? Why would our government sign off on that? We're destroying the future of this country by sending jobs overseas. Who's really behind that? Who's really behind America and our wars? Why were we really fighting in Vietnam? Why are we fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan 20 years after what happened in the events of 9/11? Why are we still there? What's the objective? And who wants us there? When you begin to ask yourself those questions, then you begin to understand, yes, that there is a deep state and there's a powerful, it's a powerful entity. But awareness is what breaks their power. They're kind of like vampires. What kills vampires is light, sunlight. Another term for light is knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you break the cycle and you can break the hold of the deep state. But that's what you must have, the awareness. And awareness also means you don't put your faith in one individual that he is going to somehow break the grip of power on an invisible group that has been operating since 1776. That is the year that Adam Weishaupt founded the Illuminati. The same year that this country was coming into existence, Adam Weishaupt was in Germany forming the Illuminati. So we're talking for well over 200 years, this group has operated in secrecy. One man is not going to break that cycle in a matter of four years. At least one, not one, that really had no intention of doing it. I think Donald Trump was more about self-promotion. And I think even now he's planning his next move. Some talk about Donald Trump forming his own television network, his own reality series, that sort of thing, because he's probably going to need, and right now, let's be realistic, um, he has his teams, I guess, fundraising teams out trying to raise money for his legal defense. What legal defense? I know he's filing lawsuits all over the country challenging the results. Most of these lawsuits have been kicked out of the state courts. They're hoping to get them to the Supreme Court. But based on what? To get into any court, you need something like evidence. And they have none. So all of these attempts have been thrown out of the lower courts. How it's going to get to the Supreme Court, only God and Rudy Giuliani know the answer to that. But he's raising funds for his legal defense, I think for other reasons. I think that once he leaves office, the Southern District of New York wants to have a long conversation with him, as well as some jurisdictions in California. And if you think that's the deep state, I think you have to go back and look at his history. For those of us in New York, or from New York, we know that the Trump family has been involved in some shady dealings for years. And there are a lot of contractors and other craftsmen that have been completely put out of business because Trump did not pay them. Down in Atlantic City, where he had his casinos, a lot of people lost a great deal of money. A lot of people went out of business because they gave Trump materials and labor, and he simply did not pay, and he just walked away like he always does. So that is my take on Trump and the New World Order or the deep state. I don't think that Trump is at war with the deep state. I don't even think that the deep state is at war with Donald Trump, at least not at this point. If you're going to get into a situation, into a gunfight, the last thing you do is give people the ammunition to shoot you with. And Donald Trump certainly did that on many occasions. So the deep state didn't have to do a whole lot. Trump pretty much did it to himself. So that's just something that I hope you will consider when you think about these conspiracy theories that are floating around the internet. These indictments that they say were supposed to be handed up and people are going to get arrested. Well, here we are. The election's been decided. Nobody's been indicted. No arrest. And as for Trump breaking the New World Order, well, that didn't happen. So, I thank you for listening, and I hope that some of what I said made some sense, and you'll think about it and consider it. And I know people have some other ideas, and I like to hear them. It's getting close to the hour for me to step aside, but the number here is 888-304-4401. I'm here every Tuesday, so if you have questions or comments regarding tonight's show, please call me and let me know what you think. I'm always interested in hearing opposing points of view, because that's how you learn, and that's how you grow, and that's how we move forward in this country. We can't go backwards. We have to move forward. Time does not, go spin backwards. It only moves in one direction. So, reach out to me. Give me a call. I'm on Facebook. You can reach me there. You can reach me on Instagram, brother_Ron. And just let me know some of your thoughts and some of what you may think about our outgoing president and even our incoming president. Because realistically, the fact that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been elected does not mean that all the problems in this country are suddenly going to evaporate. We have some serious work to do in this country. And now, once the inauguration takes place, communities of color, poor people, people who've been marginalized, need to raise their voices and need to raise them loudly and let them know, don't forget about us and only remember us when it's time for election. We need help. We need to find out a way to mitigate the spread of this virus. People need to go back to work. We need to get this economy moving again. We need to turn this country around. So, just something to think about. And I hope to see you again next Tuesday.